So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Mike Van Newkirk, Senior Vice President and Senior Client Officer with Ipsos. Mike, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session. For those of you who have been with us before, you know this is actually a three-part series. The first one we did earlier this year on electrification. This one focused on autonomous and ADAS, and then our last one will focus on shared mobility. That'll come probably in the fall time. We'll give you a specific date as we narrow in on that. But before we start, I actually wanted to share with you some recent data going back to electrification. So Chance, yep, thank you. So as you're probably aware, there is a consideration right now for an Inflation Reduction Act, and there's actually a component within there that is specific to EVs. Overall, the act itself is receiving about half of the people saying they would support it. What's really interesting, if you look at the components within the Inflation Reduction Act, at the very bottom are two particular elements: increasing IRS enforcement funding, only 49% support for that, as well as EV tax credits for people or families with incomes under 150,000. All of the other components are actually indexing higher, or they're showing a greater percentage of support. So again, very interesting in terms of how EV is being supported, both by the government in terms of the inclusion within the act, as well as how it's being received by consumers as it is part of this act. And we'll continue to look for new information and share it on time. But for today, we're going to shift back now to autonomous and ADAS, and I'm going to turn the conversation over to my colleague, John. John?
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. You go on to the next screen there, Chance. So ultimately, just to get us started, is this idea of what is the current situation, and just as what we would call as the compounding complexity of driving. Right. Overall, I like this illustration as it unfolds here. Is basically what we are seeing here is there's multitude of things impacting, i.e. distracting of the driver, and it's from the basic controls of driving to typical exterior items while driving. You know, of course, you add in the controls, you know, within the vehicle, such as, you know, the door seats, lights, HMI system. And then, of course, you also have what amounts to is interior distractions. What is that? This includes people, this includes food, this includes now alerts related to what amounts to is ADAS or advanced driver assist systems, connected services alerts, even smartphones messages, particularly as you're connected with Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Frankly, in a nutshell, there's a lot going on in the vehicle today, and that's ultimately driving some increased complexity and distraction. So if we go on to the next slide, Chance, is we have done is an element of a poll. We did this last year just to get some input on what it's like to drive today, and we did this amongst 1,000 U.S. consumers to give us some key insights. And if you go on to the next slide, what do we see? It's basically what percent of drive does a driver encounter a distracted driver? And what we see is 50% of drivers encounter a distracted driver out on the road. And that's even higher amongst those who are driving fairly frequently, at least 25 miles or more per day. They're seeing at a higher rate. So in a nutshell, there's a lot of distracted drivers out there. But what does that really mean? What is the definition of distracted driver? And, you know, there's some of these elements are a bit scary to think about, but ultimately, you know, not to be surprised, but, you know, talking on the phone is the first distraction, and we see this a lot out on the roads. But the second one is really concerning, this idea of texting or typing on a smartphone or reading a smartphone or a tablet. These are real issues because basically what's happening is their eyes are off the road. Eyes aren't paying attention to what's transpiring, and that's a real problem, especially, again, if this is happening 50% of the time out on the roads. It's a recipe for disaster as it relates to, we need some improved safety, we need some tools, features to help this distracted driver to be safer on the roads out in public. And so let's dig in a little deeper. If you go on to the next slide, that ultimately we take a look at thinking of how confident our drivers related to safety. And we probed a bit about this, and we asked about a third of consumers, of all drivers, feel confident about the safety on the road when they're driving. And as we dig in a little deeper related to cuts, we do see, gender-wise, males are a little bit more than females, not too much, but certainly more. But then we look at it generationally, what do we see? And in particular, boomers are less than 30% are confident about their safety on the roads. All this is, it just showcases us there's some differences by demographics. It's just not overly good to see this reduction in safety perceptions, as well as just the overall confidence of them on the road and participating, and that's a problem. And so that's where, if you go on to the next slide, and the real driver for what we are doing today, and certainly we are seeing in today's automotive technology is about helping improve the confidence. This idea with autonomous ADAS features, essentially working together to create a semi-autonomous experience, and then the connectivity features. All these are in the spirit of helping, of course, creating some value, but increasing some confidence for that driver, helping them improve their safety. We have 21 features in this year's installment of our 2022 Navigator to be able to share, and it's across these three buckets for us to get some insights on what is interesting to consumers. What are they after? What's their appeal? What are some of their barriers? There's just some fresh insights. We certainly look forward to diving into that. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Chance to take us through that detail. An ultimate, well, look at that, I misstepped. So the context here I want to, before I hand it off to Chance, is what is happening out in the market. And so we do get, I don't know, I guess you could say some perception of the data. What's transpiring is, does ADAS and semi-autonomous actually work? We do hear in the news, it's sensationalized, this idea of crashes happening, but are accidents getting reduced? So again, what do we see in the news, and just something that's happened over the weekend, I guess, before you hop over to that, Chance, specifically, this weekend, talking about pressure by Ralph Nader, to a political and consumer advocate, about pressing increased safety about the dangerous labeling of the Tesla, full self-driving. And it's an element of increased attention is happening because of some of these accidents, but we also have to ask ourselves, how frequent are these happening? And that's when we could go to the next slide. And so ultimately on this slide, it just highlights that, yes, ADAS does decrease the frequency of accidents. We have seen with this data that illustrates, and this comes from the Insurance Institute of Highway Safety here in 2022, and we do see on two ones I want to point your attention to. This is the forward collision warning with auto brake, as well as rear automatic braking. Over 50% of accidents are reduced as a result of these feature technologies when they're enabled. That's pretty significant to think about, but we don't hear about that. We don't hear about the missed accidents. We only hear about the accidents that do happen. But most consumers aren't aware that this is transpiring, right? This isn't out there in the market. And so this is where improved education, improved awareness about that these features actually do work, that do help improve the safety, improve that confidence of that distracted driver, is certainly going to be beneficial. And if we go on to the next slide, and this is a reminder of what's happening and covered in the market, we see most new ads from auto manufacturers around the new technology, which is around the EVs. We shared this in our last webinar about the EV advertising, like from the Super Bowl, and the recent mentions is all these new launches, which is exciting and it's great. But however, it's not referencing about the technology, right? We don't see this focus building on ADAS or autonomous. We see just a few OEMs are mentioning. I had a couple of things that I found, like with the Subaru iSight, the GM Super Cruise, or some things that are starting to be shared, but nowhere near to the level of frequency and the broadness of different OEMs offering it. We know that they exist, they're across all auto manufacturers, but I challenge the industry, why aren't we educating about this? Why aren't we increasing the awareness and the knowledge of that? And so that's where we'll get into in more detail. And now I'll hand it over to Chance to get into the details and the insight that we have from this year's module. Thanks, Chance.
Thanks, John. I really appreciate it. That's a lot of great background information and creates a lot of great context for what we're going to go over now. As Mike mentioned, the Navigator study is a 3-part installment every year, and we're going over number 2. So module 2, as you already heard, is focused on autonomous, ADAS, and other advanced features. The real focus of the study and the highlights that we'll share with you today is to understand the perceptions of autonomous driving technology and how it compares to the perceptions of other advanced, but ultimately more typical features and technologies. John mentioned we've got 21 features covered in the study this year. That's up from 14 last year. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, and please recognize that when the buyers are filling out the survey, we're giving them a detailed explanation of each one of these. But here are the 21 features that we ask about this year. 7 of these are new. We added adaptive cruise control, augmented reality guidance, auto valet parking, and the others that you can see in yellow. So what did we find out? Well, we're going to go through several series of highlights today, and we're going to start by sort of understanding what the landscape looks like regarding customer awareness and interest for all of these 21 features and technologies. Once I've gone through that, we'll dig a little bit deeper into autonomous technology. So I've provided for you the 10 features that received the highest levels of interest across all of our 5 markets, the top 10, if you will, of those 21. And what you see globally is that we see some individual safety features really capturing the highest levels of interest. The top 3 are accident avoidance, emergency service, and then a new feature that we added this year, night and all-weather vision. If we look at the US, it's very similar, if not identical. Again, those sort of individual, clearly understandable safety features rise to the top. And if we look at the rest of the markets, we see a little bit of variation, mostly with China. China is a little bit different every year in the results that we get. We also see, in addition to some variation in which features generate the highest levels of interest, we also see some pretty obvious differences in just how interested consumers tend to be in these features and technologies. As is almost always the case, the Chinese consumers in general seem to have the highest levels of interest, whereas the consumers in Japan seem to be a little bit more reserved in their interest in new features. Well, what about autonomous technology? Where does it rank? How does it fit into this mix of 21 different features? So this chart is going to show you a couple of important things. One is that buyer reaction for fully autonomous driving vehicles and semi-autonomous driving vehicles are very similar. So I've got the global results up here for you. You can see that the level of interest for full autonomy and semi-autonomy are virtually identical, and they both rank in the bottom half of those 21 features. If we look at the US, we see a very similar story. The numbers are a little bit lower, but the level of interest for fully autonomous and semi-autonomous is relatively low and relatively similar, even though people in the industry know that there's a very big difference between a semi-autonomous vehicle and a fully autonomous vehicle. We aren't really seeing that the consumers make that bright line distinction yet. And again, if we look at this for the other markets in the study, the numbers are virtually identical in every case. If we go one step further and try to look at the relationship between awareness and interest, we see some other interesting things. So here we've used a pretty liberal definition of awareness on the Y or vertical axis, and then we've plotted that against levels of interest on the X or horizontal axis. And what we see are a couple of things. One, there's no real strong correlation. And the autonomous technology features, fully autonomous and semi-autonomous, are good examples. You see them in the upper left-hand quadrant, which means they have relatively high levels of awareness among these 21 features, but their levels of interest are relatively low. Conversely, if we look at some of the features that were at the top of the interest list, they're an example of features that are both highly interesting, but also features that people are generally quite aware of: accident avoidance, advanced driver assistance systems, emergency service, adaptive cruise control to a lesser extent. And then in the lower right quadrant, we see some interesting features that are intriguing because they have relatively high levels of interest, especially given how relatively unaware people were about these features, at least before they took our survey. Obviously, once they've taken our survey and they've read the explanation of these features, they're much more aware. But coming in, they weren't super aware of these features, yet when they read about them, they found them very interesting. This next chart is another relationship chart in which we try to understand, is there a correlation or a relationship between how interested people are in features and their willingness to pay? And here, unlike the previous chart, the results are very clear. The features that generate the highest levels of interest tend to be the features that also generate the highest levels of, yes, I would probably be willing to consider paying for these features. Again, if we look at fully autonomous and semi-autonomous technologies, they fall toward the bottom. They're not generating high levels of interest, and they're commensurately not generating a lot of appetite for paying extra for these vehicles. And this again may speak to what John hinted at earlier. The hard data suggests that these technologies are effective. The maybe softer data among consumer perceptions, like this one, suggests that maybe people don't appreciate that or they don't understand that. And there may be a need, as John mentioned, for much greater communication about the potential of these technologies to improve your situation as a driver. Again, against that backdrop of incredible complexity in the cockpit in today's vehicles and just lots of distractions happening around you. Now, these are just some highlights of those 21 features, and obviously the study has so much more in it. We provide rankings, we provide scorecards for each feature by country, by demographics, etc. If you're a subscriber, I really encourage you to dig into that information. It's fascinating and fun. And if you're not a subscriber, well, obviously we think you should be. So with that, I'm going to keep going and share some more highlights that hopefully will whet your appetite for the Mobility Navigator program. So let's now veer away from just these individual features, and let's talk about sort of the core purpose of the study, and that is to look at how people are reacting to autonomous technologies, primarily fully autonomous technologies, but we also have some data in here about how they react to semi-autonomous technologies. Remember, as we saw earlier, there doesn't seem to be a big distinction in the sort of hive mind of the consumers out there about these two technologies. Most of the time, their answers to various questions are virtually identical, whether we ask the question about autonomous tech or semi-autonomous tech. I mentioned earlier that we provide a description for these various technologies, and I just want to be clear in how we have described a full autonomous technology or a full autonomous mode to our respondents. Basically, I won't read the whole thing for you, but basically we are describing a fully capable self-driving, certainly level 4 vehicle, if not level 5. And that is something that we all know doesn't really exist in the marketplace yet, sort of regardless of what Tesla says or regardless of how Tesla names their autonomous technology. So this is an aspirational sort of vehicle that we ask people about. And one of the first things I want to start with is a look at awareness of full autonomy. And I've shown it to you here for the global total and for all the countries. And as you can see, full autonomy globally and for 3 of the 5 countries is pretty flat. There's not much going on in the US with regard to awareness. There's not much going on in Germany or Brazil when it comes to awareness. People are just not that aware, and that awareness doesn't seem to be changing. In China and Japan, however, we're tracking a decline in awareness for autonomous features. We don't know exactly why that is within the study's data itself. We have reached out to our colleagues in those markets in Japan and China, and their qualitative response to the question is simply that the buzz and the share of voice in the auto industry and to the consumers in China and Japan has been completely dedicated now to electrification and electric vehicles. And there is very little talk, if any, about any kind of autonomous technology in those markets. That actually brings me to my next point. Mike talked earlier about the previous module for the study, the Mobility Navigator program, focusing on electrification. And what we are seeing is a complete disconnect almost between what's happening with consumer awareness and interest in battery electric vehicles and what we are now tracking with autonomy. I've just taken the previous chart where we looked at the awareness levels for full autonomous by country, and I've plotted in this last 2022 result for battery electric vehicle awareness. And as you can see, the contrast is striking. The awareness for battery electric vehicles has really risen, is much, much higher and running far ahead now of what we're tracking with autonomous. Electric vehicle, you can't see it from this chart, but electric interest is continually increasing year over year, which is obviously the opposite of what we're seeing with autonomous, where it's remaining relatively flat. We also ask if people have experienced any autonomous technology, either having driven a car or having ridden in a vehicle with those kinds of features. And as you would expect, as more of this technology does make its way to the market, experience is increasing, but really only slightly. I mean, globally, it was flat for the last 2 years, up a bit this year. You know, we see a slow, steady increase in the US, China, a little bit more in Brazil, pretty slow increase, I'm sorry, in Germany, a pretty slow increase in Brazil, pretty slow increases in China. So the experience factor is still really the minority of consumers out there. Most have not yet experienced autonomous technology. And that's important because we have known from past studies that experience plays an important part in increasing interest and consideration. So here I've divided people into two groups. We've got one chart for the global total and one chart for the US only. The orange bar represents people who have ridden or driven in a vehicle with semi-autonomous features. The green or teal bar, if you will, represents people that have never experienced either driven or ridden in a vehicle with those features. And then the percentage is their level of interest in the technology. As you can see globally, having experienced this technology basically increases your interest by about 2x. And in the US, that figure is even greater. It's basically 3x. So, you know, part of helping people become more interested in these features is to have them experience them. But if we look beyond sort of experience and interest and awareness, and maybe look a little bit closer to where the rubber meets the road and look at purchase consideration, again, I've shown you the last 3 years of purchase consideration for the global total and for the US. And the story is similar. It's very flat. You know, the number of people that say they would consider this technology is small. It's definitely the minority, especially in the US, under a third, and it's only growing slowly. So why is that? Why isn't consideration growing faster? Well, one of the things that we looked at this time around, based on what we found with electrification, may help provide some answers. And that is, we are continuing to see this potentially sticky generation gap between younger buyers and older buyers in experience and attitudes toward, in this case, autonomous technology. If we look at awareness and we look at what happened this year versus last year, you can see that the younger buyers' awareness has gone up. For the older buyers, both Gen X and Boomers, it's flat. If we take another step forward and ask them how positive they are about autonomous, we see again with the younger buyers, they're more positive this year than they were last year. For the older buyers, both Gen X and boomers, they're actually a little less positive about autonomous than they were last year. If we ask people if they've experienced autonomy, again, we saw how important that is in the previous couple of slides. Again, the younger buyers are more likely to have experienced semi-autonomous technology this year versus last, whereas the older buyers, their experience is flat. We aren't seeing the increases that we see with the younger buyers. And as a consequence, as you would expect, the younger buyers are even more interested in autonomous technology than they were last year, whereas the older buyers are actually less interested than they were last year. And for Gen X, the generation in the middle, their interest really hasn't changed much. So let's take this again a step forward to sort of where the rubber meets the road and look at purchase consideration for these three groups this year versus last year. You see some important things. If you look at Gen Y, which is the teal bar, you can see that purchase consideration has gone up 6 points this year. But if you look at the younger buyers, you actually see that, or the older buyers, you actually see that consideration is trending down. So again, this is an apparent and potentially growing gap in this consideration for autonomy for the younger buyers versus the older buyers. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're saying to yourself, yeah, younger buyers are always more interested in technology than older buyers. That's been the case forever. What's the big deal? Well, you're right. It is a phenomenon that's been well understood for a long time. It doesn't matter which industry you're in. The younger buyers tend to be the early adopters, and the older buyers tend to be a bit more reserved and take their time before they're converted. But in this situation, with technologies like battery electric vehicles and autonomy, this is a unique situation, and I think makes this gap a potentially bigger deal. Both of these technologies are not simply features that you can choose to use or not in your vehicle. It's not just a button that you can ignore. It's not like, for example, voice recognition. These are transformational technologies that fundamentally alter how you interact and live with your vehicle. And if you consider that and the billions of dollars that's being poured into them, I think it makes the stakes of this generation gap incredibly high. And that's why we think it is worth noting. At some point, you can't just sell to early adopters. At some point, you've got to sell to the mass market. And this generation gap indicates that there may be issues getting to some of those mass market consumers. Let's look at two other groups that are different in the way that they think about autonomy. So first, I'm going to start with those who are likely to consider autonomy. And I'm showing you a list of statements that we asked them to tell us how much they agree or disagree with. And again, this first group is US considerers. These people are totally on board with autonomous, and they see a whole wide range of benefits. And the benefits that they see extend beyond just their own personal benefit. So you'll see the third line down is will provide a more comfortable and relaxing driving experience. You know, for me, that's a personal benefit. But look at the higher levels of agreement for some of the sort of societal benefit questions. Will be of great benefit to people who cannot or should not drive, people that perhaps are handicapped or elderly. Will reduce crashes and fatalities, will save lives, will reduce traffic congestion, will reduce CO2 emissions. These people, these considerers, recognize the potential societal benefits well beyond the personal benefit that they also recognize and associate with autonomy. That being said, and this is another key point to remember, we'll come back to it in a bit, even these pro-autonomy consumers indicate that there's a time and place for it. If you look at the bar that's sort of darker, dark red, that is for the statement, I would only use autonomous mode in certain situations. So remember, we defined autonomous mode as pretty fully capable self-driving vehicle. And yet even these people, the majority of them, almost 3/4, think that, yeah, maybe, but I would still want to be in control of when I enable that capability to be in play. Now let's flip the page and look at the other side of the coin, if you will, and look at how non-considerers react to these same statements. It's very different. These people, yeah, sure, the top statement up there is I would prefer to drive a vehicle manually, and that's to be expected. But some other things that are important is that they do not see the societal benefits that autonomous could provide and that the avoiders certainly do see. They say, you know, they would be concerned about safety for others is something they're worried about, but they just don't agree with the reducing emissions, the reducing fatalities, the reducing congestion, the save lives questions. What they are concerned about is their safety, the safety of others, and somewhat new this year, they're a little bit worried about the expense and the cost associated with autonomous vehicles. You can see the two bars highlighted in orange. One is it will be too expensive for me, and one is I would be concerned about increased insurance premiums. So this group, again, these two sides of the coin in some ways couldn't be more different. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, again, as we try to figure out ways to promote and educate around these technologies. One final cut of how the pro-autonomy considerers differ from those that aren't likely to consider. What you see here are the statements in which the gap between those that are pro in orange and those that are not in gray is the greatest. So these aren't necessarily the questions that have the highest level of agreement, but these are the questions in which the level of agreement differs most between those that would consider and those that would not. You can see that will save lives, will reduce crashes and fatalities, will reduce congestion, will reduce CO2 emissions are all more indications that they just don't see the societal benefit of autonomous that considerers do see. You also see they don't agree that they will lower my transportation costs, and they're really not even on board on it providing a more comfortable and relaxing driving experience. So who are these people that are so different? Well, if you look at the profile of likely autonomous considerers, you can see that they tend to be relatively young. That's no surprise given the charts that we reviewed earlier. You know, almost 2/3 of them are likely to be Gen Y or Gen Z. They skew a little bit male. They're more likely to have children at home. They're more likely to commute to work, even in a post-COVID age. They're much more likely to live in an urban setting. And as I mentioned, they believe in autonomous both personally and societally. The vast majority of them have actually experienced some form of the technology. They're not surprisingly self-styled early adopters for all things, on a number of things, not just vehicle things. A bit surprisingly, they report that they actually enjoy driving and want a well-rounded, versatile vehicle. And as we saw earlier, recognize that there are times when they may not want to avail themselves of autonomous technology. And they tend to be less loyal, again, which is sort of a characteristic that we tend to see of younger buyers in general. Now remember, this is only 1/3 of the population that fit this profile. The other 70% almost are people that are less likely or unlikely to consider autonomous technology. These people tend to be a bit older. They tend to skew slightly female. They are unlikely to have children at home, either because they are retired or perhaps they work from home. They are much more likely to live in a suburban or rural environment. And as we have seen, they're skeptical about autonomous and its benefits. They have not experienced semi-autonomous for the most part, and they tend to be a bit more brand loyal. Another question that we ask in the survey sort of has some implication for this notion of people may still want control, even if they are pro-autonomous. So we ask people, okay, let's assume that there's no price premium, that all these options are available to you for roughly the same price. Which one would you pick? And the 4 choices are, I would purchase a manually driven vehicle, I would purchase a semi-autonomous vehicle, I would purchase a selectively autonomous vehicle, or I would purchase a fully autonomous vehicle. So last year, just under half preferred a manually driven vehicle. with most of the other half choosing either semi or selectable autonomy. As you might expect, given that it's not a real available product right now, very few people opt to select for full autonomy. Another way of thinking of this, though, is that almost 3/4 of the buyers needed control. They either want a manually driven vehicle outright, or they want to be able to select when to use these autonomous features. We again think this has important implications. If you look now at what happened this year, we see very little change, right? We still see the majority of the people want a manually driven vehicle, and then those that opt for autonomy sort of split equally between semi-autonomous and selectively autonomous. And again, we think the implications of this are important, from the need for clear information and education to make sure that people understand what semi-autonomous is, what full autonomy is, when they should use it, when it doesn't work. We also think it has implications around things like user interfaces and controls for autonomous features, given that people seem to want some ability to control these features. The industry has got to make sure that the interfaces and the controls are intuitive and easy to understand and provide the control that these buyers may be after. We also asked people how they viewed the future. When do they think autonomous technology will be here? And interestingly enough, despite the generally tepid response to autonomous as something they would like, people seem resigned to the fact that it's coming fast. The dark and light teal bars highlight people that answered that it will be here, and by it, I mean a fully autonomous vehicle that can handle all road conditions. They think it will be here within less than 5 years. The dark bar is within 3, the lighter teal bar is within 5. And for the first time, the majority of the people that we surveyed in the US think that full autonomy will be a reality within the next 5 years. So even though only the minority of consumers are really pro the technology and would plan to consider it when they purchase a vehicle, the majority of the buyers out there think it's coming. One final thing that I wanted to share with you, we also ask what brands people associate with having the ability to build and provide safe and reliable autonomous vehicles in the next 5 years. Not surprisingly, given, frankly, both the technology that they have included in their vehicles and, frankly, also the way that they name that technology, Tesla tops the list of brands that consumers trust for autonomous technology. But one interesting thing that happened this year is we gave people the option to say none. I don't think anybody will be able to do that. And you can actually see that this was the most popular answer this year. Again, perhaps indicating and reflecting some of the skepticism that people individually feel towards autonomy in the shorter term, even though, as we saw with the last slide, they think it's coming and coming pretty quickly. So let's wrap up real quick. What we know from this year's study is that interest in autonomy is stagnant. It's flat across most markets. We also know that this is the complete opposite of what we are seeing with EV awareness and interest, both of which are skyrocketing. But even though almost every battery electric vehicle that is out there also is a showcase for the manufacturer's latest autonomous technology, autonomous tech is just not tagging along with EVs when it comes to awareness and interest. It needs something dedicated to it, as John mentioned earlier. We also see that consumers don't seem to differentiate very much between a semi-autonomous feature and a fully autonomous feature. We see that there are concerns mainly around safety, and also this year some indications that they're worried about the expense. And we talked about the generational gap, which maybe not surprising, but we think is a high stakes issue. We know that experience improves acceptance and interest, but it's not doing enough because not enough people are experiencing these vehicles, especially when you get to the older buyers. John mentioned the need for more education on autonomous technology and their benefits. People need to understand not only what this technology can do for them, but some of those societal benefits that those pro-autonomous considerers see, but the non-considerers simply don't. Safety concerns must be addressed. John talked about how the data is clear that the technology does improve safety, but the results of the data suggest that people just don't know that yet. And so they need to be taught, frankly. But we can't stop there. Consumers need more education and more convincing information on what the cost picture is. Some have concerns about data security and, again, those societal benefits. And then finally, we think that control is still a key issue for consumers. The driver needs to know that they have full control to engage or disengage this autonomous technology at their disposal. And they need more education about that, about the technology, what it does, what it will do, what it can do, what it can't do. And they need simple interfaces on how they can control it. So that is really a summary or some highlights of some things that we think are important in this year's study. We thank you for attending. We hope you found the highlights as interesting as we did in preparing them. Look, the Mobility Navigator program really is fantastic. It's one of the more fun programs that I've worked on, and the data is really very interesting, and we hope that you will see that. We're talking about 5 countries. We're talking about digging into why people would adopt these new technologies that the industry so much needs them to. And we're covering some fascinating topics: electrification, autonomous and ADAS and advanced features, and as Mike mentioned this fall, shared mobility. So with that, I will stop talking and turn it back to Mike and John and see if we have any questions from the audience.
Hey, thanks, Chance. We actually did get a few questions. I know we're really close on time, so if I don't get a chance to bring your questions, we will follow up with you on that particular one. But there was one that caught my eye immediately. John, I'm going to throw this one to you because I think it's kind of interesting. It's a little broader. This is specific to what we've been seeing talked about: supply chain issues, chip shortage, things of that nature. Do we think that there's any contribution there that's hampering the interest overall or the adoption of ADAS and autonomous features?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. I think the obvious notion is that, you know, the ADAS features and added advanced technology require the chips, right? And so therefore, that's what's causing a shortage really in the market because of that demand. However, I don't see any of our data suggesting the lack of excitement or interest in autonomous as a result of that shortage. It's just, of course, the shortage in and of itself is a result of a higher need for more chips in vehicles, and then that's industry-wide phenomenon that we've all dealt with over the last few years as a result of COVID, right, with all of the shortages and supply chain issues. But nevertheless, I don't see that the interest is a result of it. It's just more that's impacting the supply, if you will, and the ability to get the vehicles themselves. So
yeah, and if I could add to that, we saw how important experiencing the technology is. So any factor that, you know, keeps an autonomous, semi-autonomous vehicle off the road is limiting experience, and we know that's important.
All right, great guys, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. So we're actually at time. I'm going to save the last questions for something that we'll respond back to you individually. So expect some responses from us. For that, I want to thank everybody for their time, for joining us again. Look forward to seeing you when we do shared mobility. And as Chance mentioned, this study does offer even so much more wealth and depth of information on autonomous, on electrification, and then coming soon on shared mobility. If you have interest, please reach out to any of us. We look forward to talking to you in the fall. Thanks again, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.